Some witnesses claim that certain devices were installed through those holes. One witness in particular is frequently quoted in this context, Kula, a former Auschwitz inmate who worked in the camp's metalworking shop. During 3 post-war depositions, he made a number of statements about Auschwitz, several of which are demonstrably false, which casts a very unfavorable light on this witness's trustworthiness. Of interest for our topic are 2 of these depositions where he gave more or less detailed, yet partially contradictory descriptions about the devices allegedly built by his workshop. The first description, made prior to the show trial against former camp commander Rudolf Höss, described a column consisting of 3 layers. An inner, removable wire mesh column, 20 centimeters wide and deep, was surrounded by 2 more columns of a wider wire mesh. The outer column was 3 meters high and 70 centimeters wide and deep. The problem with that column is that it was too big even for the only 2 existing holes in the roof of Crematorium 2. The biggest of them is barely 50 centimeters wide. During the trial, Kula testified, and while so doing, changed the dimensions of the column. Most importantly, its width had now shrunk to only 24 centimeters, hence roughly a third of his initial description. Interesting in this context is Kula's description of the inner column, which could be removed. It is said to have consisted of an inner layer of solid sheet metal and an outer layer of a fine wire mesh screen with openings of merely 1 millimeter. The inner sheet metal column was capped with a pyramid-shaped lid. Zyklon B is said to have been poured onto this pyramid. The gypsum pellets subsequently fell into the space between the inner sheet metal column and the outer wire mesh screen. This would maximize the pellets' exposure to the surrounding air and thus accelerate the evaporation of hydrogen cyanide. After the crime, the inner column could be removed, thus making a swift ventilation of the room possible. Hence, Kula's columns are the orthodoxy's magic bullet to reduce the time during which the claimed gas chamber's walls would have been exposed to the lethal gas. The problems with this are manifold. First, as mentioned before, Kula obviously was a liar. Next, there is no documentary or physical evidence that these columns ever existed. Furthermore, these columns would have to have been firmly anchored in a panic-proof manner in both the floor and ceiling of that room, leaving indelible traces of the anchoring points. Here is a drawing on how structures are being anchored in concrete after the concrete has already been poured. But there aren't any traces of such anchoring points. A large part of the floor of Morgue 1 of Crematorium 3 was actually cleared of all rubble during excavations carried out in August 1968. French historian Jean-Claude Prisac showed a photo of that excavation in his 1989 book on page 234. Not a trace of any anchoring points was found, though. There aren't any visible in the ruins of Morgue 1 of Crematorium 2 today either. Even Orthodox historians agree that Kula's columns had to be firmly anchored with massive bolts in the floor and ceiling of the claimed gas chambers. Here is a photo of a column built following the directions of the already mentioned Jan van Pelt, clearly showing the bolts that would go into the floor and ceiling.